The early morning sun cast long shadows across Harold Peterson's well-maintained front lawn as the 93-year-old veteran followed his daily routine. His weathered hands, marked with age spots and old scars, carefully lifted the watering can to tend to his beloved roses. The morning air was crisp and clean, just the way he liked it. Harold had lived in this modest two-story house on Maple Street for over 5 decades. The white paint might have been slightly faded, and the green shutters could use a fresh coat, but to him, it was paradise. Every morning, he would wake up at exactly 6 o'clock a.m., a habit he never lost from his military days. His bones might creak a bit more these days, but his spirit remained as strong as ever. The neighborhood kids called him Mr. P, and they often stopped by to hear his stories about World War II. Harold enjoyed their company, especially since his wife Martha passed away 3 years ago. The children would sit on his porch steps, eyes wide with wonder as he told them about his adventures as a young soldier in France. Today was Tuesday, which meant it was Veterans Center Day. Harold put on his best blue shirt, carefully pinned his service medals to his chest, and combed his thin white hair neatly to the side. He might be in his 90s, but he believed in looking presentable. Martha had always said, "Age is no excuse for sloppiness," and he lived by those words. The drive to the Veterans Center took exactly 12 minutes. Harold's old Buick knew the way by heart, just like its owner. Inside the center, the familiar faces of his fellow veterans greeted him warmly. There was Bob Thompson, 85, who served in Korea, and Frank Miller, 89, who had been in Harold's unit during the war. Their numbers were getting smaller each year, but their brotherhood remained unbreakable. "Hey, Harold," called out Jenny, the young receptionist. She always had a smile for everyone, but she took special care of the older veterans. "I saved you some of those butterscotch candies you like." Harold's eyes twinkled as he accepted the treats. They reminded him of the ones Martha used to keep in her purse. The morning passed pleasantly as the veterans shared stories, played chess, and discussed current events. Harold won 2 games against Frank, who playfully accused him of cheating. "It's all that gardening," Frank grumbled good-naturedly. "Keeps your mind sharp while the rest of us are getting rusty." Around noon, Harold headed home, stopping at Murphy's grocery store for his weekly supplies. The owner, Mike Murphy, was the son of Harold's old friend from the war. "The usual, Mr. Peterson?" Mike asked, already reaching for Harold's favorite brand of coffee and wheat bread. They chatted briefly about Mike's daughter, who had just started college, the first in their family to do so. Back home, Harold spent the afternoon in his garden. The roses were Martha's legacy. She had planted the first bushes 40 years ago, and Harold had maintained them meticulously since her passing. Each color had a special meaning: red for their love, yellow for their friendship, and white for the purity of their memories together. As the sun began to set, Harold sat in his favorite armchair by the window, a cup of tea steaming beside him. From here, he could see the old warehouse across the street. It had been empty for years, its windows dusty and dark. The for sale sign had finally come down last week, and Harold wondered what would become of the place. The evening news played softly in the background as Harold dozed lightly in his chair. Pictures of Martha smiled down at him from the walls, mixed with old black and white photographs from his military days. One showed him as a young man, standing proudly next to his military motorcycle. He had been so young then, full of fire and adventure. Before heading to bed at his usual time of 9 o'clock p.m., Harold checked all the locks and turned off all the lights, except for the small porch light that he always left on. It was a habit he started when Martha began having trouble seeing the steps at night, and he never stopped, even though she was gone now. As he lay in bed, Harold smiled contentedly. It had been another good day in a long line of good days. He had no way of knowing that his peaceful routine was about to change dramatically, and that the quiet life he had built for himself was about to face its biggest challenge yet. The peace of Maple Street shattered early one Sunday morning. Harold was tending to his roses when the first motorcycles roared down the street. The thunder of engines echoed off the houses, making his old windows rattle. 5 bikes, then 10, then 20. They kept coming, all heading toward the old warehouse across the street. Harold watched with growing concern as leather-clad figures dismounted their motorcycles. Their bikes gleamed in the morning sun, all chrome and polished metal. A tall man with a thick beard and tattooed arms seemed to be in charge. He unlocked the warehouse doors while others unloaded boxes and equipment from trucks that had followed the motorcycles. "Welcome to your new home," Thunder Raiders, the bearded man shouted, his voice carrying across the street. The bikers cheered and revved their engines in response, creating a wall of noise that made Harold's teeth rattle. His neighbor's cat, usually asleep on the front porch, ran away in terror. Over the next few days, the warehouse transformed. The bikers installed bright lights and huge speakers. They painted their logo, a lightning bolt through a skull, on the warehouse wall. The quiet neighborhood Harold had known for 50 years changed almost overnight. Mrs. Anderson from next door came over for coffee, wringing her hands in worry. "Did you see them, Harold? Some of them have these terrible tattoos covering their entire faces." She jumped at the sound of another motorcycle roaring past. "I'm thinking of moving in with my daughter in Florida." Harold tried to stay positive. "Maybe they'll settle down once they're properly moved in," he said, but even he didn't believe his own words. The noise kept getting worse. The bikers held meetings every evening, and their motorcycles came and went at all hours. Music blasted from their speakers until midnight, and sometimes even later. One morning, Harold found his driveway blocked by 3 motorcycles. He walked across the street, his back straight despite his age, and entered the warehouse through its open door. The smell of oil, leather, and cigarette smoke filled the air. Several bikers lounged on beat-up couches, while others worked on their motorcycles. "Excuse me," Harold said politely, raising his voice to be heard over the rock music blaring from the speakers. "Could you please move the motorcycles blocking my driveway?" The bearded leader, who Harold now knew was called Big Mike, looked up from his phone. "What's that, Grandpa? Speak up." Several younger bikers snickered. Harold repeated his request, trying to keep his dignity. Big Mike stretched lazily and nodded to one of his men. "Move the bikes for Gramps here before he has a heart attack." "And could you please keep the music down at night?" Harold added. "Many of us are trying to sleep." This time, the snickers turned to outright laughter. Big Mike stood up, towering over Harold. "Listen here, old-timer. This is our place now. We bought it fair and square. If you don't like the noise, maybe it's time to check into a retirement home." More laughter followed Harold as he walked back to his house. His face burned with humiliation, but he held his head high. That evening, the music seemed even louder than usual. Harold could feel the bass vibrating through his walls as he tried to watch his evening news program. He called the police twice that week, but they could do little. The bikers had permits for their business, and while they pushed the limits of noise ordinances, they knew exactly how far they could go without breaking any major laws. The final straw came when Harold discovered motorcycle tracks across his front lawn. Deep tire marks cut through the grass he had carefully maintained for decades. From his window, he could see 2 young bikers giving each other high fives, obviously proud of their handiwork. That night, Harold sat in his armchair, looking at the old photographs on his wall. The peaceful life he had built was crumbling around him. Mrs. Anderson had already put her house up for sale, and other neighbors were talking about moving too. As he finally went to bed, the familiar rumble of motorcycles filled the air again. Harold lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how things had changed so quickly. Little did he know that this was just the beginning of a situation that would test his patience, wisdom, and character in ways he never expected. The situation on Maple Street grew worse with each passing day. Harold's morning routine, once a peaceful start to his day, became a test of endurance. The bikers had taken to parking their motorcycles wherever they pleased, creating an obstacle course of chrome and steel that he had to navigate just to reach his mailbox. One particularly difficult morning, Harold found 3 motorcycles completely blocking his garden path. As he tried to squeeze between them to reach his beloved roses, he lost his balance. His hip bumped against one of the bikes, and it wobbled dangerously on its stand. Harold's heart nearly stopped. If that bike had fallen, he would never have been able to afford the repairs. "Hey, watch it, old man," a voice boomed from across the street. A young biker with spiky green hair came running over. "That's my ride you're messing with." He checked his motorcycle for scratches, glaring at Harold the entire time. "I wouldn't have touched it if it wasn't blocking my garden path," Harold explained calmly, though his hands were shaking. "This is my property, young man." The biker, who couldn't have been more than 25, laughed mockingly. "Your property? This whole street belongs to the Thunder Raiders now. Most of your neighbors were smart enough to figure that out." He was right about the neighbors. The Anderson house next door stood empty now, its windows dark and a "So Oldie" sign hanging crooked in the overgrown lawn. The Williams family across the street had moved out last week, and the Pattles on the corner were packing their moving truck today. Only Harold and a few other stubborn residents remained. Harold tried calling the city council. The young woman on the phone sounded sympathetic but helpless. "I'm sorry, Mr. Peterson, but as long as they have their business permits and don't violate any major ordinances, there's not much we can do." The police were equally unhelpful. Officer Martinez, who used to patrol the neighborhood regularly, stopped by one afternoon. "Look, Harold," he said quietly, "these guys know exactly how far they can push things without breaking any serious laws. The best advice I can give you is to be careful. Maybe consider moving somewhere quieter." But Harold refused to be driven from his home. This house held 50 years of memories. Every room echoed with Martha's laughter, every corner held a story. The garden she had lovingly planted was his last connection to her. Moving wasn't an option. The bikers seemed to take his stubbornness as a challenge. They began holding their loudest parties on weeknights, the bass from their speakers making Harold's windows rattle. Their gatherings spilled onto the street, with motorcycles parked on both sides, making it nearly impossible for other vehicles to pass. One evening, Harold was returning from the Veterans Center when he found the entrance to his driveway completely blocked by a group of bikers. They were gathered around their motorcycles, drinking beer and laughing loudly. Harold waited patiently in his car, hoping they would notice him and move. After 5 minutes, he carefully honked his horn. The group turned to look at him, but nobody moved. Instead, Big Mike sauntered over to Harold's car window. "Something wrong, Grandpa?" he asked, his breath smelling of beer. "Driveway blocked?" "Yes," Harold replied steadily. "I'd like to park my car, please." "Well, we're kind of in the middle of some..." The morning that changed everything started like any other. Harold woke up at his usual time of 6 o'clock a.m., made his coffee, and looked out his kitchen window toward his garden. The cup slipped from his trembling hands and shattered on the floor when he saw what had happened overnight. His rose garden, Martha's precious legacy, lay in ruins. Motorcycle tracks cut deep gouges through the flower beds. Broken stems and crushed petals scattered across the mud like fallen soldiers. The white roses Martha had planted on their 40th anniversary were completely destroyed. The red ones from their first date were trampled into the dirt. The worst of all, the special yellow roses, the ones Harold had planted after Martha's funeral, were torn out by their roots. Harold stood in his garden, his slippers soaking up the morning dew. His weathered hands touched the broken stems gently, as if trying to comfort them. 50 years of memories lay destroyed before him. He could still remember Martha's voice. "Yellow roses mean friendship and joy, Harold. Plant these when I'm gone, and you'll always remember the happy times." The rumble of motorcycles broke through his grief. A group of Thunder Raiders pulled up across the street, returning from what seemed to be an all-night ride. They were laughing and talking loudly, clearly drunk from their night out. One of them pointed at Harold standing in his ruined garden. "Hey, look. Grandpa's up early to check out our handiwork," shouted a biker with a snake tattoo on his neck. "Sorry about the flowers, old-timer. We needed a new shortcut to the warehouse." Big Mike stepped forward, swaying slightly. "Ah, did we mess up your little garden, Gramps? Don't worry. Now you won't have to waste time watering those stupid flowers anymore." The group erupted in laughter. Some of them made exaggerated crying gestures, wiping fake tears from their eyes. Others revved their engines, adding mechanical thunder to their mockery. Harold stood perfectly still, his back straight despite his age. The morning sun highlighted the medals pinned to his old bathrobe. He always wore them, even at home. They caught the light, drawing the attention of a younger biker who nudged Big Mike. "Hey, check it out. The old man's wearing his war medals with his pajamas." What a joke. But something strange was happening inside Harold's mind. As he stood there, surrounded by the destruction of his beloved garden, he didn't feel the anger or helplessness he expected. Instead, memories began flooding back, memories he hadn't visited in decades. He remembered being young, just 20 years old, roaring through French villages on his military motorcycle. He remembered how his unit would sometimes get rowdy after successful missions, celebrating their youth and survival with little thought for the local residents. He remembered one particular old man who used to shake his fist at them from his garden. The laughter of the bikers faded into the background as Harold picked up a broken yellow rose. Its petals were still perfect, though the stem was snapped. He thought about how that old French man had eventually become a friend to his unit, sharing wine and stories with them in the very garden they had once disrupted. Something funny, old-timer? Big Mike's voice cut through Harold's memories. You're smiling. Finally losing it, huh? Harold looked up at the group of bikers, seeing them clearly for the first time. Behind their leather jackets and tough expressions, he saw something familiar. Something he recognized from his own youth. They weren't just troublemakers. They were young people looking for belonging, for excitement, for their place in the world. Still holding the broken rose, Harold straightened his medals and walked slowly toward his house. The biker's laughter followed him, but it didn't seem to touch him anymore. He had experienced an unexpected moment of clarity standing among his ruined roses. As he closed his front door, Harold glanced at an old trunk in the corner of his living room. He hadn't opened it in years, but he knew exactly what was inside. Tomorrow would be different, he decided. Tomorrow, he would show these young riders something that might change everything. For the first time since the Thunder Raiders had arrived, Harold felt a spark of hope. Sometimes, he realized, destruction could lead to unexpected new beginnings. That evening, after the bikers' laughter had faded and the street grew quiet, Harold climbed the creaky stairs to his attic. Dust particles danced in the beam of his flashlight as he made his way to an old military trunk tucked beneath the sloping roof. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the key in the lock, not from age this time, but from anticipation. The trunk's hinges groaned as he lifted the lid, releasing the smell of aged leather and memories. On top lay his old military uniform, still crisply folded despite the decades. Beneath it, wrapped in a faded cloth, was a leather photo album he hadn't opened in nearly 50 years. Harold carried the album downstairs to his favorite chair by the window. From here, he could see the warehouse across the street, now decorated with the Thunder Raiders' skull and lightning logo. A few motorcycles still gleamed under the streetlights, their chrome reflecting the evening glow. Opening the album, Harold felt his breath catch. The first photograph showed a young man in his early 20s, sitting proudly on a massive military motorcycle. His hair was dark, his smile confident, and his uniform crisp. It was hard to believe that young soldier was him, now aged by 7 decades of life. The Flying Eagles, Harold whispered, touching the photograph gently. That's what they had called themselves, his motorcycle scout unit in France. The next pages showed more young men with their bikes, all of them looking invincible in their youth. There was a photo of their whole unit parked outside a French cafe, their motorcycles lined up like soldiers on parade. Harold remembered how the local residents used to complain about their noise, about how they'd race through the narrow streets, about their late-night gatherings where they'd drink wine and sing American songs until dawn. Another photograph showed Harold and his best friend Jimmy performing stunts on their motorcycles for a crowd of cheering French children. Jimmy never made it home from the war, but his wild spirit lived on in these yellowed images. As Harold turned the pages, more memories surfaced. There was the time they'd accidentally driven through Madame Bouvier's prize-winning flower garden while avoiding German patrol. She'd been furious, chasing them with a broom and cursing in French. But later, after they helped her replant everything, she became like a mother to them all, baking them pies and mending their uniforms. A small smile crossed Harold's face as he realized something. He and his unit hadn't been so different from the Thunder Raiders. They too had been young, rowdy, and misunderstood. They'd found brotherhood on their motorcycles, just like these modern bikers. Near the end of the album, Harold found what he was looking for, a photograph of his pride and joy, his 1942 Harley-Davidson Doliole military motorcycle. The same one that was currently hidden under a tarp in his garage, maintained in perfect condition all these years. Harold had kept the bike running, tinkering with it on quiet weekends, but he hadn't ridden it since Martha passed away. She used to love sitting behind him on rare rides through the countryside, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist as they relived their younger days. Standing up with newfound energy, Harold walked to his garage. He pulled the tarp off the motorcycle, revealing gleaming chrome and army green paint. Every piece was original, lovingly preserved or restored over the years. The leather saddle still carried the smoothness of countless rides, and the Army serial numbers were still clearly visible on the frame. As he ran his hand along the familiar handlebars, Harold began to form a plan. These young bikers thought they had him figured out. Just another grumpy old man complaining about their noise and disruption. But they didn't know about the young soldier who had once raced motorcycles through war-torn France, who had found brotherhood on two wheels long before they were born. Tomorrow, Harold decided, he would show them a different side of Grandpa. Maybe, just maybe, he could build a bridge between their two worlds using the language they both understood, the freedom and brotherhood of motorcycles. Looking at his reflection in the bike's polished headlight, Harold saw both the young soldier he had been and the wise veteran he had become. Sometimes he realized the best way to fight wasn't with anger or complaints, but with understanding and shared experiences. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Harold woke up earlier than usual, his heart beating with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. He had spent half the night in his garage, making sure every chrome surface on his old military motorcycle shone like new. His hands smelled of polish and old leather, bringing back memories of nights preparing for missions in France. At exactly 10 a.m., when the Thunder Raiders usually began gathering at their warehouse, Harold put his plan into action. He put on his old leather riding jacket. It still fit, though a bit more snugly than 70 years ago. He pinned his service medals to the leather, each one telling a story of courage and brotherhood. The hardest part was getting the garage door open without drawing attention. Harold wanted the element of surprise. He could hear the bikers across the street, their loud voices carrying through the morning air as they discussed plans for their next ride. With steady hands, Harold wheeled his 1942 Harley-Davidson WLA into the driveway. The morning sun caught its army green paint and gleaming chrome, making it look like a piece of living history. He had maintained every original detail, from the leather saddlebags to the military serial numbers stamped on the frame. Taking a deep breath, Harold swung his leg over the saddle, surprised at how natural it still felt after all these years. The key slid into the ignition, and with one practiced kick, the engine roared to life. The sound was different from modern motorcycles. Deeper, more mechanical, with a rhythm that spoke of history and adventures long past. Across the street, the Thunder Raiders fell silent. Harold could see them turning to stare as he guided the vintage motorcycle toward their warehouse. Big Mike stepped forward, his usual mocking smile replaced by a look of genuine surprise. Is that a WLA? One of the younger bikers pushed through the crowd, his eyes wide with amazement. That's a genuine World War II military bike. Harold brought his motorcycle to a stop in front of the group. The engine's rumble echoed off the warehouse walls, steady and strong like a soldier's heartbeat. With practiced ease, he engaged the kickstand and dismounted. Yes, it is, Harold said calmly, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. This was my bike during the war. I was part of a motorcycle scout unit called the Flying Eagles. We rode through France, gathering intelligence and sometimes raising a little hell of our own. The bikers gathered around the vintage motorcycle, their earlier hostility forgotten in their fascination. Harold noticed how carefully they kept their distance, showing unexpected respect for the piece of history before them. You actually rode this in the war. Big Mike's voice had lost its usual aggressive edge. He was staring at the military markings on the bike's frame. Harold nodded, running his hand along the familiar handlebars. Rode it through 5 campaigns. Lost my best friend Jimmy while we were on a scouting mission. Nearly lost my own life a few times too. But this old girl never let me down. The young biker with the snake tattoo who had laughed at Harold's garden yesterday now pointed to one of the medals on Harold's jacket. Sir, is that a silver star? It is, Harold replied, noticing how the biker had switched from old man to sir. Got it for a night mission behind enemy lines. Our unit had to ride with our headlights off, using only moonlight to guide us. Lost 2 good men that night, but we got the information back to headquarters. The atmosphere had completely changed. The bikers listened intently as Harold began sharing more stories. He told them about racing through French villages, about close calls with enemy patrols, about the brotherhood that formed between young men far from home. Would you mind if we took a closer look at your bike? Big Mike asked, almost shyly. We've never seen anything like this up close. Harold smiled, seeing his younger self in their eager faces. Of course, and if you're interested, I could tell you about the time we had to jump a destroyed bridge while carrying vital intelligence. The morning stretched into afternoon as stories and motorcycle talk flowed freely. For the first time since they arrived, the Thunder Raiders weren't being loud or disruptive. They were too busy learning from a master rider who had earned his stripes long before they were born. The changes in Maple Street happened slowly at first, then all at once. In the weeks following Harold's surprise motorcycle revelation, the atmosphere around the Thunder Raiders warehouse began to shift. The constant roar of engines gradually became more considerate, and the late-night parties grew less frequent. It started with Jake, the youngest member of the Thunder Raiders. He was only 19, with bright blue hair and a passion for motorcycle history. The morning after Harold's visit, Jake showed up at Harold's door with 2 cups of coffee and dozens of questions about the Duel motorcycle. "Mr. Peterson," Jake had said nervously, "I was wondering if you could tell me more about how you maintained your bike during the war. I'm studying to be a motorcycle mechanic, and well, they don't make them like that anymore." Harold had invited him in, and soon their conversations became a daily routine. Jake would arrive each morning, eager to learn from Harold's decades of experience. He was particularly fascinated by the old mechanical solutions that didn't rely on modern electronics. One Saturday morning, Jake noticed the destroyed rose garden while leaving Harold's house. His face fell as he looked at the trampled flowers. "We really messed up your garden, didn't we, Mr. Peterson?" The next day, Jake returned with several other Thunder Raiders, including Big Mike. They carried garden tools and new rose bushes. We'd like to help fix what we destroyed," Big Mike said, looking uncomfortable but determined. "None of us knew about your wife, about what these roses meant to you." Harold taught them how to properly plant roses, just as Martha had taught him years ago. The young bikers, usually so rough and careless, showed surprising gentleness with the delicate plants. They listened intently as Harold explained which roses needed more sun, how deep to dig the holes, and the importance of proper spacing. "Yellow roses mean friendship," Harold told them, helping Jake plant a new bush. "Martha always said they were the most important ones in any garden." The garden project became a regular weekend activity. Other Thunder Raiders started joining in, first out of curiosity, then out of genuine interest. Harold shared stories as they worked, telling them about his wartime experiences and his life with Martha. The bikers, in turn, opened up about their own lives. "My dad was a veteran too," Big Mike confessed one day while carefully watering the new roses. "He never talked about it though. Wish he'd been more like you, Mr. Peterson." The noise levels from the warehouse decreased naturally as respect grew. The bikers started parking their motorcycles more considerately, making sure not to block driveways or damage gardens. They even helped Mrs. Anderson, who had returned from Florida after hearing about the changes in the neighborhood. Harold's military motorcycle became a centerpiece of their shared interest. He taught them about its history and mechanics, showing them maintenance techniques that had been passed down from his war days. The Thunder Raiders, in turn, helped him add a few careful modifications to make it easier for him to handle at his age. One particularly meaningful moment came when the bikers discovered Harold's old photographs. They spent an entire evening listening to stories about the Flying Eagles, asking questions about different missions, and the brotherhood of wartime riders. "You know what, Mr. Peterson?" Jake said, looking at a photo of young Harold on his motorcycle. "You guys were the original motorcycle club. The Flying Eagles were doing this way before any of us." The other bikers nodded in agreement. They began to see their own reflection in the stories of young soldiers finding freedom and brotherhood on 2 wheels. The parallel between their club and Harold's old unit became a source of pride and responsibility. The warehouse itself started to transform. The skull and lightning logo remained, but the space became cleaner and more organized. The bikers set up a small museum corner displaying Harold's wartime photos and motorcycle memorabilia. They even started inviting other veterans to share their stories. "We're thinking of starting a veteran outreach program," Big Mike told Harold one evening, "using motorcycles to help veterans connect with younger riders. Would you help us set it up?" Harold looked at his restored garden, now tended by both himself and his unlikely new friends. The roses were blooming again, yellow ones especially bright among the others. Martha would have loved this unexpected turn of events, he thought. Sometimes the best gardens grow in the most surprising places. 6 months after Harold first revealed his military motorcycle, Maple Street had become a different place entirely. The Thunder Raiders warehouse, Once a source of neighborhood tension, had transformed into a thriving community center. The building's fresh paint job still featured the club's lightning bolt logo, but now it shared space with the Flying Eagles emblem, a tribute to Harold's old unit. On a warm Sunday morning, Harold stood in his garden, admiring the roses that now bloomed more beautifully than ever. Jake worked beside him, carefully pruning the yellow rose bush while asking questions about Harold's latest war story. The young biker had become like a grandson to Harold, spending most of his free time learning from the veteran's experience. "Mr. Peterson," Jake said, wiping sweat from his forehead, "the special vest we ordered finally arrived. Would you come to the warehouse? Everyone's waiting." Harold followed Jake across the street, where they were met by an unusual sight. The entire Thunder Raiders club stood in formation, their motorcycles arranged in a perfect semicircle. Big Mike stepped forward, holding a leather vest unlike their usual ones. "Harold Peterson," Big Mike announced formally, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "We'd like to make you an honorary member of the Thunder Raiders Motorcycle Club." He held up the vest, which featured both the Thunder Raiders logo and Harold's old Flying Eagles patch. Below them were Harold's military service medals, carefully recreated on leather. As Big Mike helped Harold into the vest, the old veteran noticed something else had changed. The warehouse doors were open, revealing a large group of people inside, other veterans, many in wheelchairs or using canes, all wearing similar honorary vests. "Welcome to the first meeting of our Veterans Outreach Program," Big Mike explained proudly. "Every Sunday, we provide rides to veterans who can't drive anymore. We help maintain their motorcycles if they still ride, and we listen to their stories. It all started because of you, Mr. Peterson." The program had already made a difference. Harold saw Bob Thompson from the Veterans Center sitting in a sidecar, grinning like a teenager. Frank Miller was deep in conversation with a young biker about military motorcycles through the ages. Even Mrs. Anderson had returned to the neighborhood, now serving coffee and cookies to the gathering. The warehouse interior had been completely renovated. One wall displayed a timeline of military motorcycle history, featuring photographs from Harold's collection alongside modern bikes. A workshop area had been set up where young mechanics like Jake taught basic maintenance skills to interested veterans. "There's one more surprise," Jake said, leading Harold to a covered object in the center of the warehouse. With a flourish, he pulled away the tarp to reveal Harold's 1942 WLA, but with a difference. The sidecar had been expertly restored and modified to make it easier for elderly veterans to ride as passengers. "Now you can take your friends from the Veterans Center on rides," Jake explained excitedly. "We've added special safety features and comfortable padding. Big Mike and I worked on it every night for a month." Harold felt tears in his eyes as he ran his hand along the familiar green paint. Martha would have loved to see this, her grumpy old veteran husband now surrounded by a new family of leather-clad bikers who treated him like a respected elder. The Thunder Raiders had even started a scholarship fund in Martha's name, helping young people study motorcycle mechanics. The first recipient was a local girl who reminded Harold of his wife, practical, kind, and unafraid to get her hands dirty. As the morning progressed, more people arrived. Families brought their children to hear veterans' stories. Young bikers sat respectfully at the feet of old soldiers, learning about the brotherhood that had existed long before motorcycle clubs. The noise of motorcycles still filled Maple Street, but now it was punctuated by laughter, conversation, and the occasional war story. Harold stood in his new vest, watching his two worlds merge perfectly. The roses in his garden caught the morning sun, their yellow blooms a symbol of the unexpected friendship that had changed everything. Sometimes, he realized, the best victories in life come not from fighting against something, but from finding common ground in the most unexpected places. "Ready for a ride, Mr. Peterson?" Jake asked, wheeling out his own motorcycle. "Some of the guys want to learn that formation you used in France." Harold smiled, feeling younger than he had in years. "Let me get my helmet," he said. "And Jake, I think it's time you started calling me Harold."